YouTube. In this video I was showing you how to make this cool sci-fi or maybe cyberpunk neon scene that you were shown in the beginning of this video. I will be explaining how to create the tree, animate it, set up a particle system so the leaves look like they are falling and flying in the wind. We're going to add some tubes and add in a cool material which will look like it's feeding energy to the tree. So enough to learn. I do hope you learned something, and if you do, then please feel free to leave a like, subscribe, and a comment down below. If you decide to make this yourself, then please share with me on Instagram. It's super cool to see what you guys make. Also, I want to add that these files are available on Gumroad for just $2. If you don't want to follow along and just want to see how I did it, then please buy them. It supports me and helps me out a lot. So let's get started.
Okay, so in our first scene, let's go ahead and delete everything and add in a plane. All right, let's scale this up 50 times, so S and 50. And now I want to right click it and shade smooth and tap into edit mode. Now right click it and subdivide it. Let's add in 100 cuts here, and that's enough geometry for us. And let's go into our modifiers tab and add the displace modifier, add the texture in and change it to the type clouds. Now this is way too much and it's also too small, so let's change the size to a 0.5. Okay, so back in our modifier, and I want to set the strength pretty low. Let's go for something like a 0.05. Now let's add in our tree, and you can do that by Shift A, adding in a curve. If it doesn't pop up for you, then make sure you have the sapling tree gen add-on enabled. And with that enabled, Shift A, curve, and choose the sapling tree there. Now let's load up the preset of the Japanese maple here. Now let's change a few of the parameters to get the tree that we are looking for. I'm going to branch splitting here. I'm going to change the height there to a 0.6, 0.5 maybe. I want to add in a level of branches there. Changing back to 0.5. Just looking for the result that I'm looking for. I'm just going to add in the leaves real quick, see how it looks. Okay, so these are way too few leaves. So I'm going to go back to branch splitting now. I'm going to crank up the levels to 4 here. And I'm going to change the height back to 0.6 and the trunk height to 0.5. And this is the tree that I want. So now I'm going to add in the armature here. So click use armature. And I'm going to crank down the levels to 1. This can take a while to load, by the way. So don't worry if it gets stuck for a bit. Now let's go into the animation here. I'm going to go and change the overall wind strength to a 0.5. I'm going to hit armature animator. I don't need to animate the leaves. It's just overkill in this case. And now if we play this back, it's going to be very slow, but you can see it does move. Okay, cool. So next up, I want to add in our camera. So Shift A, add in a camera, press numpad 0 to go into our camera view. Hit Alt R to clear the rotation, and then RX 90 to make it face forward. And now I'm just going to move this up. So GZ and moving it up, GY to pull it back. And I'm going to look for the angle that I'm looking for. I'm going to change the focal length to 32 millimeters. And I'm going to add in some depth of field here and choose the leaves object as the focal point. And I'm going to change the f-stop to a 0.3 there. And I'm just going to position the camera in such a way that I'm happy with what I'm looking at. Changing the sensor size there to 40 millimeters. I'm just going to rotate it on the X a bit so I can get the tree for the most part inside of the screen. And this is pretty good. So I'm just going to add a keyframe here. So I and choose location rotation. Now let's go to our last keyframe. First of all, let's extend our animation to 450 frames and go to the last frame there. And I'm going to zoom in and rotate the camera upwards. Cool. And I'm going to add in another keyframe, location and rotation. And that's the camera motion all done. Now I'm just going to position the first keyframe on the 150th keyframe because the animation will run from 150 to 450. So with that done, I'm going to select both of the keyframes, hit T, and then choose linear interpolation to make the movement constant. All right, so now let's open up a graph editor here. I'm going to add some noise to the camera because I wanted to get more realism. So on the Y rotation for the camera here, I'm going to press N in the graph editor here. I'm going to modifiers and adding in a noise modifier. Now this will be way too strong. So let's tweak some of the parameters here. I want to set the scale to a pretty high number. So not 0.1, but actually a very high number. So maybe go for 60. And our strength should be a 0.1. And I want to limit the effect for the actual animation. So 150 to 450. And that should be all for the camera motion. Now it's just rotating a little bit, making it more realistic. And that's what I like. I'm just going to close off the graph editor. Now let's go back to our first keyframe here. So technically 150, although we haven't changed just yet. We'll do that later on. I'm going to add in a Bezier curve. And this will be the tubes that you saw running along the ground here. So I'm going to select one of the vertices here and move it to the origin in there. And select the other one and move it to the side. Now I can just hit E to extrude these and then R to rotate and S to increase the curvature there. So just pulling these out, changing everything until I get a result that I'm happy with. Now I want to make sure that the line actually is above ground, but not too much. So I'm just going to pull all of these up or down, depending on where they are. So G, Z, holding shift and then moving them. I want to rotate the endpoint here and move this one a bit down so the line disappears into the ground. And I'm going to go into the geometry tab for the object data properties here. I'm going to change the bevel here to a point. Let's go for 0.12 here and increase the resolution to 8. And now we have a tube with about the same size as a tree trunk, which will feed energy to our tree. Okay, so let's rename a few of our layers here. I'm going to rename the plane to ground and the Bezier curve to tube. Now I want to select all of the parts of my tree and deselect the ground here. And I'm going to put them in a collection, a new collection, and calling it tree. Hit OK. Now that's done. And I want to duplicate the tubes here. So I'm going to change the pivot point to 3D cursor. And I'm going to hit Shift D, R, and then rotate the tube. I want to repeat this step a couple of times. I think I'm going to go for 5 in total. Now, of course, I will need to tweak some of these to make them above ground and make them unique. So let's go about and do that. I'm going to select one of the tubes and then moving things up, rotating it ever so slightly, making sure it follows the ground sort of. And also I want to make it look unique. So I'll just speed this up and just go ahead and make them all look unique and individual, making sure they don't go above ground too much, but they can sort of leave it as well. And just make sure they're all above ground at least. Like so. And I want to make sure the endpoints of all of them go inside of the ground as well. All right, so that's pretty cool. I'm happy with that. Now I'm going to add in a plane here, and this will be for our particle emission. But first, let me just select all of the tubes there and put them in their own collection as well. I'm just going to put this collection inside of the tree collection. And let's move up the plane that we just created. That's going to be our particle emitter. So let's go into top view with numpad 7 and scale this up. I'm going to edit it and subdivide it 2 times. And I want to move all of these vertices around so they sort of have the shape of our tree. Doesn't have to be exact as long as it doesn't stick out, because you will notice particles spawning outside of our tree and we don't want that. Just pulling all of these, sort of covering the shape of our tree. Like so. All right, that's pretty cool. Let's rename this to particle emitter. And let's add in another plane. And I'm just going to solo this with the / button. And we're going to create our leaf here. And I'm going to subdivide it once and select vertices here, these two, and scale these in S with X and pull them down. So G, Y. I'm going to do the same for these two, S and X, scaling them on along the X axis. With these two as well, moving these up with G and Y again, maybe pulling them out slightly. So I'm just going to go for one of the 5 blades of the leaf. That's looking fine. Just selecting all the faces here and moving it up so the bottom vertex aligns with the origin there. And I'm just going to hit Shift D, R, and then rotate it and duplicate it. I want to scale this down, so hit S and Shift Z so it doesn't move along the Z layer. And make it small, rotate it to the other side with a duplicate again. Duplicate it once more, rotate it again, and just scale this one down as well. So S, Shift, Z, and duplicate it and rotate it to the other side. I can select all of these, hit Ctrl J to merge them, rename this to the particle leaf, and that will be our object. Now you will see it's way too big, so let's just scale this down so it's sort of similar to the size of the leaves on our tree. And just move it to the side because we don't need it to be in our view. Now I can select both of these objects and put them in their own collection as well, calling it particles, like so. And let's set up our particle system. So with the plane inside of the tree selected, let's add a particle system. I'm going to select the particle system there and the ground because I needed to see if everything works fine. Let's change some of the parameters here. So I want about 500 for the number there. Let's switch on rotation and put it on dynamic. Let's go into our field weights and change the gravity to 0.05 so they fall slowly like leaves. And let's just play this back, see what happens. Make sure the tree is switched off because it will render in the background and slow down my computer. Well, the lifetime is way too short, so I'm just going to increase the end there to 450 and the lifetime to 450. They don't need to die. And now you can tell they are going up and then they are falling down slowly. And that's because they have some velocity. Just changing the normal velocity here to 0. And now they will fall down. And that's looking good. And finally, I want to change the type here in render from halo, of course, to object and select the particle leaf object here. Now it is working, but the leaves are very, very small. That's because the scale is way too small. So let's set it to 1. And let's change the scale randomness. Well, that's still too much. Let's go for 0.25 here on the scale randomness. And that should be our leaves falling. Now I want them to be rotated individually. And to do that, I just need to go back to rotation here. Make it random like so. And that should be it. Now they all have a random rotation. Cool, but they are still falling straight down. And to fix that, I'm going to add in a force field. So Shift A, go to force field and choose turbulence. Now let's move this up so it's sort of on the same spot as the particle emitter there. And let's go into the strength here and let's just play this back, see what happens. You can already tell it's doing something, but it's just too weak. So I'm going to go for 10. I actually think this is too much. So let's go for something like 7. Yeah, that's looking nice. I'm just going to move this up slightly because I don't want them to go up so much. I kind of like how this is looking. Now the particles are still falling through the floor. So let's just fix that. I'm going to add a collision physics properties and a rigid body. I'm going to set the rigid body to passive so it doesn't fall anymore. And now the leaves should bounce off, just like bouncy balls, which is also not what we want, of course. So I'm going to change some things in here. Add some stickiness, damping of 0.5 and a friction of 0.5. And let's see how that looks. And they are sticking to the ground, which is pretty good, but they're sort of jittering around, and that's because the friction is probably too low. So let's just increase the friction a bit to something like maybe a 6 or so. I think that'll do. And let's see how this looks. Yeah, so that's perfect. All right, so let's just bake this out so we can remove the turbulence. So hit bake there. It's going to take a bit. And when it's all done, we can remove our turbulence and the animation of the leaves will still be the same. Perfect. Now I can re-enable the tree here and add the particle collection that we made to the tree collection. And now one very important part I think I forgot is to make sure that show emitter is checked off because we don't want to see the plane in the final render. That finishes up our tree. So let's add in a collection instance of our tree here and move it to the side here and go into our camera view so we can actually see it. And now I want to rotate this along the Z here, giving it an angle that I'm happy with. So something like this will do. I'm just going to duplicate the collection instance, pull it to the other side, rotate it as well, making it all unique angles. And that's all of our trees done. All right, now we can set the start of our animation at 150, and that should enable us seeing leaves falling on our first frame of our video. And that's what we want, so cool. Now, finally, let's add in our volumetrics here. So I'm just going to add in a cube, scale it up a bunch so it covers our entire scene. Go into viewport display and change it to wire so it doesn't block our view. And let's add in our material here, just renaming it to volume, removing the surface material, going into the volume tab here and adding a principled volume. Now I want to change the color to white, the density to something like a 0.05, and the anisotropy to 0.95. Awesome. Now let's add in our HDRI. So go to the world settings, change the color to environment texture, and I'll put the link for this HDRI in the description so you can download it. And now I want to go into shading. So first of all, I've selected the leaves object here, and I'm going to add a emission shader to them. I'm going to change the strength to something like 10 and the color to a pinkish color. Now it doesn't look very good just yet, and that's because we need to change some EV settings. So let's change these samples here to 128 and the viewport up as well. Add our ambient occlusion and our bloom, screen space reflections, motion blur, and the color management, set the look to very high contrast. That's looking way better. Now for our cube, I just want to increase the volume strength a bit. So I'm going to go to something like a point. Let's go for 0.07. Yeah, that's looking nice. All right, so let's make sure our particle leaves have the same material. So select the object there and add the leaves material. And now I want to select the ground here and add a material there as well, calling it ground, of course. And it's going to be a very basic material. So I'm just going to add in a color ramp here, plug it into the roughness, add in 2 noise textures. So noise texture and duplicating that with Shift D and plugging it into each other. Then hit Control T, which if it doesn't work for you, you should go into preferences and make sure you have the Node Wrangler add-on enabled. Now let's crank up the detail for both of the noise textures and the roughness to something like a 0.6 or 0.7, depending on what you want. Now I'm just going to solo the ground here so I can better see what's going on. And I'm going to hit Control Shift and click the color ramp so I can see the texture in just black and white values. That's pretty good. So cranking the values up there and hitting Control Shift on the principled BSDF so I can get my material back again. And I'm just going to tweak some of these until I get a result that I'm happy with. I'm switching the white and black values here. All right. So that's good. Yeah, I'm happy with that. I'm just going to change the black to a dark gray so it reflects a little bit less. I'm going to change the base color and make it slightly grayish, just a bit darker. And that's looking good. Now let's solo out again with the / and go back to our full scene and work on the tubes material here. So adding in a new material and calling it tube. Now make sure the tree also has the tubes material. And let's solo our single tube here and work on the material here. We're going to do a few different things, but first of all, we're going to make the parts so it looks like it's actually made up of several different parts. So I'm going to add in a bump node here, add in a color ramp, and a wave texture, plugging all of these into each other. The color of the color ramp goes into the height there. Change the scale to 10 on the wave texture. Hitting Control T again and changing into UV coordinates. And now if I pull the black and white values in, we should get something nice. And I'm just going to add one more color there, like so, and change this one to black. So black, white, black is what we're going for. And now we can just pull these in and we get these indents, making it look like it's made up of all these different parts. Cool. Okay, so that's all done for our bump there. Now for the roughness, let's add in a color ramp, plug it into the roughness, and crank up our metallic to 1. Now let's add in a noise texture again, plug it into the color ramp, crank up the values there, pulling them in. Now I'm going to change the roughness there, and the detail is going up as well. I'm going to give these object coordinates instead of UV. And making it less reflective, pulling in the white more, and changing the black to dark gray and the white to light gray. And that's all we need to do for the roughness. It's looking pretty nice. Now, finally, I want to make the light that passes through it. So it's not as hard as you might think. So let's add in our color ramp again, plug it into the emission, add in our gradient texture, plugging it into the color ramp and hitting, plugging in the mapping node for the UV again. And as you can tell, we have a gradient following along our object now. And if I pull in the black there and change the white to blue color and set the value to 4 so it's nice and strong, then you can tell we have this cool blue light now. Now I can pull black all the way back again and white as well. I'm just going to add one more color there, pulling it to the side like so and setting it to black as well, effectively disabling our emission there. And now we have a small part of our object with the emission. I'm just going to keyframe all of these. So select each of the colors and hover over the position and hit I. And now let's open up a new window there and change it to timeline. And let's go to, let's go for 1.5 seconds for a full loop of our light to pass through. So let's go to 195 here. And let's change the position of all of these. So the most right one goes to 1 and the white one goes to let's go to 0.98 here and hit I again. And the black left value goes to 0.96 and make sure to keyframe that as well. All right, so it's going to play pretty slowly, but you can tell the light is actually going forward and moving through the object, which is what we want. It's pretty cool. Now, you want to loop this, so let's change our bottom window here to a graph editor and select our object. Let's go down and go to the properties here. I have all 3 of the properties there. Let's look up our graph. And now we need to make sure that the cycle. So let's select the keyframes and put the interpolation type on linear. And select just one of the values here. Open up our menu with N, add in a modifier and choose cycles. That's fine. And let's do the same for the other 2 values as well. Do make sure to do all 3 of them because else it doesn't work properly. And now it automatically loops. Nice and easy. Okay, so let's work on our emission material for the leaves, making it pulsate because it's getting fed energy. So let's go to the first frame of our animation, 150, and keyframe the strength for the emission at 10. Now let's go 30 frames ahead, so 180. Oh, that's the wrong value. Change that back to 150. Yep, 180 here. And keyframe it again at 10. Now let's go to like 195 or so and set the strength to maybe, I don't know, well, 25. Yeah, 25 looks good. And keyframe that as well. And let's go back to 10 now and set it back to 10 again and keyframe that again. Selecting all of these keyframes here, and we want to cycle these as well. So on the left, make sure you select the value there, add in the cycles modifier again, and that should loop the pulsing. So that's nice. All right, looking good. Now I want to do some compositing here, so I'm just gonna render out a single frame. All right, make sure use nodes is enabled, and let's add in our viewer node here. Plug it in the image in there as well. Shift, right click and drag over it to combine these 2 together. And let's add in a lens distortion here and duplicate this one. Plug in both of them into the image, adding in a mix node here, mixing the 2 lens distortions with about 50%, and enabling jitter on the top one and adding a dispersion of 0.03 on the bottom one. And that's all the compositing I want to do here. Now let's make sure we have everything set up for our scene to render out. So ambient occlusion, bloom, screen space reflections, motion blur, and the look at very high contrast. Now I have everything set to full HD, 150 to 450 frames, 30 FPS. Choose a safe location here, changing the file format to FFmpeg video, going into encoding and changing it to MP4, and of course the quality on perceptually lossless. And let's render it out. Okay, so that brings us to the end result again. This video was very fun to make. I hope you guys enjoyed it and I hope you guys learned something. If you did, then please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. It helps out a lot. If you decide to make this yourself, please feel free to share it with me on Instagram. It's super awesome to see. I would like to point out that these files are available on Gumroad for just $2 if you just want to see how I did it. And I hope to see you in the next one.